Welcome to the Durham District School Board's Education Finance meeting for July the 2nd. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And we'll begin with the land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, North America. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. Are there any declarations of a conflict of interest? All right, seeing none, we have one set of we have to approve the agenda as it is laid out. Are there any discussion to the agenda? No? Can I have a motion? Great, okay, Scott, seconded by Ashley. All those in favor? All right. So sorry, now we have one set of minutes from the June 26, 2019 Public Education Finance Committee meeting. Are there any errors or omissions? Any discussion to those minutes? All right, seeing none. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Carolyn? Christine, all those in favor? Okay, and I apologize, I should be using everybody's proper trustee names. I will endeavor to correct that. All right, so we are on to item 6, which is our 2020-2021 draft budget presentation.
Thank you, Trustee Forbes. Tonight we're here to present our proposed budget plan for the 2020-21 school year. And I'd like to first of all begin by acknowledging the work of the finance team. Both Jen and Melissa are with me tonight and have been with me through this process. And in particular, I just want to emphasize the amount of work they put in this year to get the numbers before you and to our board in record time. I'd also like to express my sincere appreciation to our senior team for having such a direct involvement in developing our proposed 2000-2001 expenditure plan. I really sincerely thank them all. I'm going to ask if Melissa can flip the slides for me, and I think we're on to the next slide, Melissa. So let me start off by saying that our budget schedule this year was completely changed, and as a result of the school closure and the events that unfolded with respect to the pandemic. So typically we would see a GSN come out in about the end of March, early April, and this year it was June 19th when they finally arrived. So that necessitated a considerable shift in our schedule and really did compress our timelines. The good news is that we're still targeting to submit our budget on time for the end of June. Or the end of July, I should say. The good news about the presentation tonight and the budget plan that's before you, and it really is the highlight of our presentation, is the very fact that we did manage to achieve a balanced budget for you this evening. Our total revenues do balance to our expenditure plan. Next slide. A balanced budget requires a considerable amount of enveloping and guidelines and limitations that are set on us by the ministry in areas such as class size. We have to comply with class size regulation. We definitely can't underspend. Well, we can underspend our special education envelope, but you can't redirect any of the underspending to other areas. And that is true also in special purpose grant envelopes, where the money is identified for particular purposes, and any underspending in those categories would have to then be set aside, reserved for that purpose in the upcoming year. Next slide. On the transition, there we go. So again, I want to emphasize that the GSNs were announced back in June. And really, the good news when the grants were released was the fact that we were concerned about there being significant changes and potentially clawbacks in the grants, and that did not appear to be the case. What they did do was, in fact, follow through with funding all of the centrally negotiated components of the agreements. And that included not only the wage increases of 1% and benefit adjustments, but also where they had identified additional student supports in the form of additional positions to the sector. They have, in fact, funded that as well. So those amounts have been identified and they are supported. They moved to an average class size for secondary school of 23. Initially, you'll recall last year, there was quite the shock to the system when the class size average for secondary was posted at a 28-to-1 and funded at a 28-to-1. And they, through the bargaining process, did move to a 23-to-1 class size. They did increase grants for supply teachers, and of course that was a welcomed adjustment. That's an area of underfunding and has been for a number of years, where it has lagged behind what the actual experience of school boards has been. With respect to transportation, they did hold the level in 2020-21 to the 19-20 level. However, there is a clawback, which is highlighted here, of $563,000 to the Durham District School Board for basically it represents fuel savings as they project them in the grants that would relate to since the March closure. So they're clawing back those dollars, but they have not imposed any additional clawbacks in the 2021 allocation. The 2% adjustment to the non-salary component of the school operations grant are for such things as cleaning supplies and service contracts. And that again is consistent with what the sector has been experiencing as increases in past years, grant increases in past years. And with respect to COVID related grants, the new announcement, and this came out just before the GSNs were announced, there was an announcement by the Minister of grant specific allocation to school boards for mental health and technology. That has not yet been released to individual boards. It will be a table amount that they will set. Further to this, they did indicate that there will be additional funding provided for personal protective equipment. But again, none of the details of those announcements are known. So one of the things that was very notable in the allocations this year in the technical paper, as you read through them, there seems to be a lot of moving of grants around, and there was grant realignments. This is where they've enveloped in different categories and pulled out what used to be or formerly was provided outside of the GSNs, and where they had what's called a transfer payment agreement, which was required by the board and the ministry to both sign off on. They seem to have pulled some of those funds back inside the GSNs, which again, that's always welcomed. When funding does come inside the GSNs, it allows for, it indicates more stability for the school board, and it does allow for, if staff are what is required to deliver the program, it allows us to have the confidence of putting the permanent staff in place. And that occurred in this range of areas: experiential learning, the mental health and well-being component, the curriculum and assessment implementation. Again, this is PD for for educators, and they pulled that in. And the last item was a new allocation, and this is for software licensing. The reality here is that the amount of $35,000 does not compare to what was formerly being provided under a provincial license agreement. Many of those licenses will expire at the end of the calendar year, and now boards are on their own to pay for those licenses. But it is a step in the right direction with respect to recognizing that software is very much a necessary component of how we deliver education going forward. Realignments. The next is the recategorization of grants. And again, this is where they've pulled into the envelope some of those components that were formerly under transfer payment agreements, and they've put them under an envelope under learning opportunities. So there's still a very significant ministry control over the dollars. But again, it's an indication that there's more permanency to the funds than transfer payment allocations typically provide. Under program leadership, that allocation again has been moved out of admin and governance, and it's now a standalone grant. And the last thing they've done is a lot of renaming, and here's the renaming components. So 4 grants were renamed. So I want to just, again, go back and emphasize that if you've downloaded the technical paper and you've seen the thickness of the document, the lion's share of that document explains a bunch of reallocations, recategorizations, and renaming, as opposed to it being representative of a lot more money. Again, the ministry did hold true to what they did say, and that was most of the funds were essentially dealt with at the bargaining table, and there was going to be very little additional improvements to the grants beyond that. Next slide. The COVID-related costs I spoke to very briefly is a serious concern for us and for other boards as well. We know that they had indicated, ministry has indicated that there will be additional funding for cleaning supplies, but I believe they've identified approximately $4 million for that provincially. And I can tell you that just looking at our own board's numbers and looking at the commitments we may have to be making with respect to PPE and cleaning supplies to have those on hand in the volumes that we may need, that $4 million provincially does not even compare to what the potential cost will be to individual boards. Again, depending on the ability for us to maintain physical distancing in our classes. Again, it will be provided through a separate transfer payment agreement. I know that anything beyond in terms of expenditures for COVID, there has been indication by the ministry in their documentation that they will allow boards to use any surplus funding or surplus balances from last year's GSNs, being the 2019-2020 budgets. And of course, there may even be an opportunity to apply some of our cost pressures to the ministry directed funds that were under transfer payment agreements, but that would have to come with ministry approval. And we in fact have done some of this already, recognizing that there was a lot of pressure to supplement technology as the closure happened. And we in fact did already start tapping into our what was going to be unspent balances for the year. Next slide. So for the funds that are outside of the GSNs, again, I think it's important to recognize that this does not represent the full list at the moment. The ministry has indicated that they're withholding about 40% of the total funding, which they typically provide. They expect to release that later in the year, so we'll wait on that. There is an allocation under the math strategy amount there of nearly $1 million. And we believe that we will be directed to apply those dollars to the new math curriculum, of course, and training for that. But as such, the boards have not yet received any of the details in the transfer payment agreement to know exactly what the requirements will be for any of the grants outside of the GSNs. Slide. So when we look at where we are with respect to total revenues for 2001, it's listed here. Our grant amount is as shown, and we do have some additional items when we look at fees and recoveries. That needs to be also considered in our overall total, as well as any drawdowns from our accumulated reserve. So the next slide speaks to exactly what those other sources of revenue are. Under other government grants and fees, we're looking at international tuition fees as being a source, and we recognize that next year we may be challenged with having people come and return from their homes back to Canada. And for that reason, we have in fact projected a reduction in our international student fees. For those students that are here and did not go home and have stayed in place in Canada, we do expect to see them in the fall as well. For revenues and expenditure recoveries, these are things like leases and cafeteria recoveries. Again, we believe that we will be seeing a slight decrease, certainly in the cafeteria recoveries, particularly because there's discussion now of not reopening our cafeterias for the time being until, again, other situations improve with respect to the fall. But in reduced leases, we're being cautiously optimistic, perhaps, that the government will not further impact our ability to generate lease revenues to cover off the expenses for the space that's currently leased out to some of our partners, such as childcare. The accumulated surplus, these are monies that we have set aside for particular purposes, and retirement gratuities is an annual expenditure where we have already a fully funded reserve for this, and we only draw that reserve down as the retirements occur and the expenditures are incurred. So now I'm going to turn to our planned expenditures for the year. That was the revenue side of the equation and provided our source of funding. And our planned expenditure, I'll go through. I just want to start off with this first slide is just reminding everybody that the main driver of our expenditure plan and our grants, it really is, everything has to do with enrollment. And I want to also emphasize that we do have growing areas of the board, but we also have areas of decline. So overall, the Durham Board's enrollment growth is pretty neutralized by the areas of decline. We've got stable enrollment, that's a good thing, but we do not have spiking growth in enrollment by any stretch. So our budget planning, again, is dependent on very stable enrollments. And for this reason, again, I want to just give a shout out to our planning staff who have always given us good confidence in the enrollment information we're using. And we were able to develop this budget based on their projections, which don't really project a very significant change at all, as you can see. Next slide. Our key areas of focus for the 2021 budget are listed here. First of all, it's working through and developing a program plan or a budget through a pandemic is really challenging, and I'll speak to that separately. Jim will provide some information around our professional development plan. Andrea, I'm going to call on Andrea to help us out with discussing special education and the direction going forward for special education. We have increased requirements for technology that Jamila will speak to, and then I'll come back to talking about our budget realignment for WSIB and our school budgets. Those really are the key areas of emphasis in the budget plan for 2021. So next slide. So when you look at budget planning during a pandemic and you try to anticipate what will happen next year, Please appreciate that we're starting off with so many unknowns about how next year will unfold. Basically, are we going to be successful through the summer months of containing the virus or not is another big question, as people are dying to get out. And there's a lot of, folks that are going to parks, and a lot of opportunity for the clustering of individuals. It's a challenge. Ministry outside of GSN funding, as I mentioned, has not yet been released, and we don't know of any additional funding specifically to Durham with respect to COVID related costs. We've heard that we'll get some, but we again don't know the amount. So that's again another unknown for us in the budget. For these reasons, we are emphasizing the need to continue to think about flexibility in our budget. If I can ask you to turn back for 1 sec, Melissa. The flexibility in the budget is pretty important to maintain, as in order for us to be nimble and able to respond to emerging issues. We know that program delivery is going to need to be adaptable. That is one of the significant components of the different models that are being worked on in terms of program delivery for next year. We have to be able to adapt those models quickly. And so again, cost pressures that relate to these changing environments are difficult to anticipate, which is why we're working so intently and closely with other school boards, with our partner board in transportation, and as well between finance and program. This is a very, very integrated budget plan that we're proposing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it to Jim to talk about professional development.
Thank you, Carla. So as Carla had mentioned, the 2020-21 budget reflects a sizable allocation of funding towards professional development. And our strategic approach to professional development will integrate the priorities of all portfolio areas, where we ground our collective work through the principles of collaborative professionalism in an integrated model that pushes student learning and achievement forward. Due to our current conditions and the unknown variables that may have impact upon the upcoming school year, we're taking a flexible approach in our planning so that we can rapidly adapt to any changes in our circumstances. We've established 4 core priorities for professional development for the upcoming school year, which include mental health and well-being, equity, human rights and inclusion with a focus on anti-Black racism, gap closing with a focus on mathematics, and technology innovation and real-time learning, flex-time learning. Mental health and well-being for both staff and students has been met with unprecedented challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, and providing continued support for staff, students, and families will be a necessity as we plan our professional development and program delivery into the next school year. And that will ultimately form a foundation to much of the professional development we will be offering, and ensuring that mental health and well-being is integrated within all opportunities. In relation to equity and inclusive education, our work to create safe spaces that respect and reflect the identity of all of our students and families will continue to be a priority. This work has taken on greater significance in the past while, as we've seen evidence of cultural bias within our communities, in particular to those marginalized communities, that has been what we would say created significant attention within our wider scope. And specifically, I guess, looking at cultural bias towards Black, Indigenous, and any what we would say marginalized identities that we need to place focus on. Within all of that, we'll be integrating anti-oppression pedagogy within our professional development opportunities, which aims to create system changes to confront racism and all forms of discrimination. The events of this school year with respect to pedagogical continuity and delivery of a program necessitate that we make a renewed commitment to gap closing. The disruption of learning time that has been experienced during the pandemic, in addition to the release of the new math curriculum, will require the implementation of promising practices for closing learning and opportunity gaps across all disciplines, in particularly literacy and numeracy. And finally, the pandemic has created a sense of immediacy with regard to the integrated use of technology across multiple platforms in our instruction. Our ability to adapt and to support staff as they also adapt and refine their practice is key to this area of professional development strategy. And our professional development planning will continue to place focus on supporting staff with the implementation of virtual real-time learning and flex-time learning experiences for students. This will build on our current distance learning successes during the school closure period. And we're also planning for further shifts in how instruction may be delivered in a changing landscape, not realizing what the challenges of next year may bring. Thank you, Carla. That summarizes the professional development component.
Thank you. And for special education, our Inclusive Student Services team, along with the senior team, focuses leveraging the budget with emphasis on direct support to students. For example, we're really excited of the move for mental health supports into the GSNs, resulting in current postings for social work and psych staff, in addition to our current year permanent complement. Professional learning supports are being implemented, which have focus in compassion fatigue, trauma-informed practice, and increasing the use of targeted behavioral intervention strategies for supporting programming. For example, the use of escalation continuums. Our educational assistants are frontline with our students with individualized programming, and it's essential that we continue to build supports for this critical employee group. Inclusive Student Services staff working with health and safety meet regularly with QP executive, specifically around the needs and well-being of our EA team. Focus for the 2021 school year will be on supports for both the physical and mental health and well-being of our EA staff, the latter figuring essential to supporting this critical group serving our students. Inclusive Student Services will co-design in consult with QP and other partners a strategic response to EA well-being that can serve to mitigate the need for absence or injury claims that are frequent within this group.
Next slide. So with respect to technology, I just want to say that did we ever wake up to how important technology is in our lives after March 2020? We knew it was pretty important, but it became absolutely essential at that point in time for all learning and working. During that time, our IT department was able to issue 5,700 devices to students and staff so that distance learning could continue and operations weren't interrupted. There was other additional purchases that were made for internet connectivity. And again, there's an ongoing monthly cost to that as we continue to pick up the fee for those underserved areas. There's additional costs associated with repairs and replacements now with that many devices out there. And we also know that we have a commitment to a cyclical replacement program of technology for students in 7 to 12 that will continue to put pressure on the budget. This also means that you have to have IT staff support in place to help make sure that your expanded use of technology is effective. So the central department, there were positions that were added to the central department for this purpose. When we look at all of technology, we also can't forget about our corporate securities and protections to our critical data. And again, there has to be investments made in those areas. And for all of those reasons, including the fact that vendor licensing and vendor service contract costs go up, we have a large commitment in our budget to technology. Next slide. Now, WSIB and abilities management is an area that really came to our attention, and it really occurred because of an adjustment to the 2018-19 school year when the expenditures related to WSIB required us to dip into our cumulative surpluses in order to, our reserves in order to address the overage. When we look back and we look at the trend of expenditures in that category, we're approximately $3 million off between what we had established as a budget and what our actual expenditures are. And for that reason, we have realigned by increasing our budget for WSIB by $3 million in the 2021 budget. It's always nicer to have, you don't want a surprise like a $3 million expenditure item left at year end. You try to anticipate these things and put those dollars in place. And that's what we're trying to reconcile this year. But the growing impact of WSIB does, it is concerning, and it's worthy of paying a lot of attention to and making note of. And so what we've started to do is analyze both our short-term and long-term absence information and incidents reports. And we have looked at ways that we can enhance our return to work program. And it will be, in fact, focused on ensuring that we put our staff in place confidently, return them to work with a lot of support, obviously with modifications as in the past, paying a lot of attention to culture and wellness and incident prevention programs. So there's a large and concerted effort being made in this particular area. Over time, our hope is that by those investments being made, that we see that our costs for WSIB and absence-related expenditures actually go down going forward. Next item. School block budgets was an interesting discussion that we had this year. And again, it's because the year was interrupted. So as of March, doors shut, budgets are half spent. That's about 50% of last year's allocation to schools. And also there were stock rooms filled with supplies, not filled to the brim by any means, but you're halfway through the expected supply usage. So again, we looked at the possibility of carrying over, allowing schools to carry over their unspent balances from last year. And it did represent about 50% of budgets that were still available at the time of closure. So those budgets will be brought forward into the 2021 school year. And in addition to that, we will be supplementing that budget by adding another 70% of a full annual allocation. So schools, if you just simply putting the information together, would see over 100% of a budget in the year. Again, not knowing what the conditions of next year look like, we felt this is a way that could really help support schools as they're also struggling with some of the unknowns. This would be a one-time adjustment only, and hopefully not to have to be repeated. But that's how we've decided to go forward this year with the recommendation that's been built into this budget. We will not be applying any reductions to the component of school budgets that related to clerical support. So that's school budgets. So when we look at our expenditure plan in total and we look at our revenues in total, it's balanced right now on the operating side to $813 million. And these are the general categories of those totals. I'm going to take a minute to go through the areas of note. Again, staffing adjustments for class size, wage increases, and professional development are included in the chart as a total. I just want to spend a minute, if I can, on what was a fairly significant change for us, and that is looking at our class size. When the new collective agreement was ratified, we know that the elementary, there was not really any change in elementary class size. There was no changes in grants or in the class size itself. But with respect to secondary, the change for us represented a change from a 22-to-1 rate that we were at to a 23-to-1. That meant at the end of May that we were asking our secondary schools to essentially stop their staffing process and re-timetable their schools with a reduced amount of staff. So a 23-to-1 meant that there was going to be a reduction in staff overall. Most of our schools, we have 20 secondary schools, and most of them were able to make those adjustments without too much challenge. But certainly the schools that have lower enrollments were certainly challenged by that because it did mean there was a lot of program pressure being put on those low enrollment schools. So we did in fact add additional staffing to those schools so that students did not lose a range of learning pathways. The impact again of overall of the class size increase, it was for the most part absorbed through attrition with retirements and promotions and resignations of teachers. Of course, we did not have to experience layoffs. We did have to add back 15 staff, as I mentioned, to address some of the lower enrollment schools. But that was, again, we felt it was a very justified adjustment with respect to the 15 additional teachers going in. And we were pleased to see that no teachers were having to be laid off through our process. Admin and governance, you'll notice the increase on admin and governance line, and a lot of it is addressed in the WSIB adjustment that we did make. We've also added, as I said, funding to bump up our abilities management program, and of course, professional development and technology as it relates in admin and governance, we're also areas of pressure. For technology in particular, I talk about cybersecurity and some of the staffing complement increases that we put in place to help support our whole team. It's under a lot of work and pressure right now. With respect to transportation, the adjustment in transportation, again, is enrollment related. When you see it go up or down, the ministry has not changed any of the grant parameters in transportation at this point. School operations and maintenance, you'll see an adjustment there, and that again relates to the wage increases. It reflects the additional teachers that were negotiated at the bargaining, not teachers, sorry, additional staff that were negotiated at the bargaining table, as well as the increase of 2% to the non-salary components of school operations. I'm going to pause for a minute and mention that the staffing increases that were negotiated at the table will not flow to the boards. The funding for those will not flow to the boards until local agreements are in place and until any grievances that are outstanding are resolved. So those are the conditions that the province indicated come with the additional staffing that was negotiated. And again, the other non-operating adjustment that you would see on the previous page at the macro level is really a lot of the budget alignments that we're referring to previously. Next slide. So the risks in this budget are, again, anticipated risks of enrollment change, or unanticipated risks of enrollment changes. I feel less concern about that item because of the confidence that the board does have and we should have in the planning projections. Revenue changes, if the ministry decides in the fall that they really need to come back in and take some more, that's always a concern. And again, we're not quite sure where the ministry may go with respect to childcare lease revenues. We know that they have indicated that we should be continuing to support childcare and provide our space right now without a lease expense on, to the operators for the balance of the summer months, but we don't know whether or not they'll want us to continue that into the fall. That's a concern because there is, again, sizable revenues on that. With respect to some of the COVID-related pressures that we can't anticipate, staffing costs, supply costs, transportation costs, so far, all of our modeling is indicating it's within our budget. We have recognized some slight increases to certain areas, but if it goes beyond what we've obviously included in the budget, that's going to be an unanticipated budget risk and pressure. Next slide. So capital, turning now to capital, and our capital budget is actually, the revenues are 2 categories for next year. We're looking at not only our grants, which is really the lion's share, but also education development charges. And I think there's a need to really start paying attention to what our education development charges, where they're going and how much of a challenge they are becoming. I know that it's an area that other boards have paid a lot of attention to. And I think that when you start seeing the numbers and you see this in greater detail, which we'll be sharing shortly, you will probably appreciate why we need to turn our attention to this sooner rather than later. Next slide. So the current capital that is awaiting approval, we've shared this list before, but here's our list, most of them being childcare. And then, of course, the Beaverton Thora rebuild, we're still waiting on, and with hope that we'll hear good news about that particular project soon. Next slide. Okay. The other comment to make around capital is that capital revenues come in to match the approved expenditures. Because of the way capital is processed with the ministry, they don't allocate based on formula. They allocate project specific. And so if you look at and you want to, you try to find out, well, how much did we get last year to this year and why the change? It really isn't a valuable exercise to go through. Projects are funded specifically at each point through the project. You have to go and beg for ministry's approval for capital. And so it's not a fair comparison to look year to year. And for next year, we're looking at total capital essentially at about $110 million. And Melissa will have, she'll be able to go into more detail if there are any questions with respect to capital at this point. Thank you. I can open it to questions of trustees.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. So are there any questions or comments at this time? I see Trustee Edwards and then Trustee Thatcher.
Just making sure because I'm a little confused. This definitely is the in-camera session, right?
No, this is the public session of the board.
Yeah, this is okay. All right, then a couple of questions I won't comment, but one is but one I will ask is around the grants, specifically around the licensing, and that we recognize that technology we're going to spend more, and that the licensing we've been given 35,000. But we expect that we're going to have to pay for that after basically the end of December, correct? If they say, so what is that additional cost to the board? And we've obviously had to incorporate it in their budget, but what is that additional cost compared to what we used to get under the GSNs as far as to cover that?
Okay, thank you for the question. So just to clarify, the licenses that were provincially available to us, it was under a provincial license that the board had access to some software, and that is that's the reference to a lot of that software is expiring, and so we're no longer under provincial license. If we wanted to continue with that particular application, the funds are there to help support that direction. Melissa, or sorry, I'm going to ask if Jennifer has the specifics with respect to the difference between the 15 or so licenses that we're under right now provincially and versus the 35,000 we received in funding.
Sure. So there was, as you mentioned, a number, about 15 licenses that are expiring that the ministry used to provide, and they were well over $200,000. So we've had to kind of pick and choose what we've included in our budget and not just add all of them in automatically.
Great, thank you. All right, so I believe Trustee Thatcher was next, and then we'll move to Trustee Barnes and Trustee Morton. Go ahead, Trustee Thatcher.
You're muted.
Yes, and thank you. And through you, Chair Forbes. Interim Associate Director Kisco, my question is around special education. So I direct my question to Superintendent Macaulay. You did indicate, Andrew, that a focus for special education was direct support to students. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. And I would be curious as to how that differs from our past practices.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Forbes. So it is a consistent practice in Durham to mobilize most of the special education funding direct to staffing that supports students. So we are approximately 96 to 97% of the budget in staffing and benefits. And that allows to support our EAs, our CERTs, our special education class teachers, and then our inclusive student services staff that does wraparound supporting families and schools.
Supplemental, Trustee Thatcher, or?
Yes, thank you. Just wondering, and how does that differ then from, this is obviously a focus going forward. How does that differ from our past practices, Superintendent Macaulay?
Correct. It is not a change in practice, but a confirmation of practice and intentionality on directing the funding as close to the student desk as possible.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to Trustee Barnes.
Thank you, Chair Forbes. I wanted to check, we are still currently negotiating at our local table. Are we anticipating anything that might impact our budget line items, or will it all be potentially funded through the ministry?
So through you, Madam Chair, the central bargaining table essentially takes all the financial items, and that's where the negotiation concerning dollars happens. Local bargaining is really more work-related conditions. It is not intended at all to address any financial components of bargaining.
Any supplemental, Trustee Barnes? Were you okay? Great. Okay, so we will move on to Trustee Morton and then Trustee Edwards.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Forbes. I have a question regarding the Learning Opportunities Grant, specifically the demographic allocation. Could you explain to us how that works and how that could affect rural schools?
Oh, you're really, this is a real stretch because I'm going to have to scratch the back of my memory.
Okay.
The way it's calculated, I can tell you the way it's calculated. They do use statistics to calculate it. It's data that's generating demographic data in communities that generates that particular grant. The challenge with it is always that the data doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in communities as data lags how a community does change. When you ask about it specifically in terms of rural communities, I'm going to ask Jen if she can jump in here, because I'm drawing a blank on perhaps something that I'm missing with respect to the Durham community particularly. So
Certainly,
Jen,
yeah, and through you, Madam Chair. So the demographic allocation actually, to Carla's point, uses 2006 Statistics Canada Census data, and it uses indicators for low income, recent immigration, low parental education, and lone parent status. So those are the factors that are considered within that allocation.
As a follow-up then, it has nothing to do with rural versus urban?
No, it's socioeconomic information or data that's really used in that. There are other grants though that are urban and rural. There's a rural grant, and I know that I believe we do have access to, and I'm looking at Jen, We do have access to a small component of that, but it's not in the demographic components of the log.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
All right, so Trustee Edwards, I do see that Trustees Crawford and Barrett have put their hands up, so I'll just go to Trustee Crawford first.
Oh, I just had a couple of basic questions on, for instance, childcare. Is childcare, do we make a profit on childcare or break even, or is it a cost?
So again, childcare is provided by third-party providers. We're in a lease arrangement with childcare, and whether or not we break even, we cover our cost in order to provide the space, to clean the space, and heat and light the space. So we're pretty well on a break even. The concern around childcare that I referenced was if in fact the government suggests that we are to continue to offer space for free, we would not be seeing any of the offsetting revenues to the expenses we'd be incurring. And that would be a problem.
Well, where does that money come from then?
Well, that's the challenge, Trustee Crawford. We would be probably bringing that forward as a COVID-related expense to the ministry to offset. If they directed us otherwise and said that we, of course, had to provide the space for free, there, as we all know, there's nothing free in this world.
So do you mean only in COVID-related situations, or at any time?
Well, under normal circumstances, we are in fact charging a lease to cover off our expenses for childcare. It's only if in fact we're asked to extend our rentals, our lease arrangements, which currently we do not collect lease revenues from our childcare providers. And that was because we were trying to acknowledge the need and we were directed by the province to continue that arrangement through the summer.
And just had a couple. In the past, we've always shown on the public document what percentage is wages and benefits and what the other difference is, because we thought it was important for them to know, and also what part is covered by the government and what part isn't, which I guess would be a similar breakdown, like 80-20, whatever. So maybe we could show that. And I'm confused with the block budget one where we said the surplus, we'd get the balance of the surplus, but there's a 30% reduction. Can you explain that?
Yes.
30% reduction seems pretty large.
So what we analyzed was that schools, when they closed their doors in March, basically spent 50% on average. They were spending 50% of this year's, the 2019-20 budget. So they had 50% of their budgets from last year still available to them. We would bring that forward into the 2021 year. And in addition to that, we would supplement that by applying another 70% of an annual allocation to the schools. So the schools would technically, it doesn't work out exactly to 120%, but that's essentially the concept, is that it would represent about 120% of an annual budget that they would be getting next year. It's just coming from two different years. One is coming from 19-20, and the other component of it is in the 2021 allocation. It's a generous budget to schools, recognizing that they were going to have expenditures that we can't anticipate either. But at the same time, it does help the board's bottom line a little bit in terms of next year's, setting the budget for 2021, because we didn't roll out 100% as well as carrying in the full balance of last year's budgets.
So it's to offset the interruption, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So we'll go next to Trustee Barrett.
Thank you, Chair Forbes. I have a couple of rants, and then I have a couple of questions. So, and some of the rants have been mentioned, so I'll curtail my words. Somebody did say they didn't hear me speak earlier. You might regret it. So just with regards to the provincial budget, and I think that it's important to be able to put into place in public, is that the potential of the disruption to the 2020 to 2021 budget with COVID is extreme. I know, Carla, you mentioned that as well. I just want to be able to reiterate that, just based upon my own personal life, that the funding of COVID-related costs, especially if you notice that some of the larger cities and municipalities are heading towards mandatory masks. If we consider that and the cost that would mean for 7,000 employees and some 71,000 students on a mask that's going to have to replace at least daily at a potential cost of 55 cents a piece, if you do the math. So I can see that the budget's going to be potentially be in disruption for the balance of the year, and the government's going to have to be able to come up with that, because we can't take dollars out of the classroom. Licenses, I'm going to leave it alone. We know that it's already woefully inadequately funded, and that means dollars out of the classroom. And EDCs, of course, this has been a favorite rant of mine, in the sense that we have been able to adjust with new building fees. However, that does put extreme pressure on us, especially in a growing board, where the necessity of purchasing property and the potential that we saw of deficits of hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for property that is not going down in price. So that's kind of my rant. Now I have some specific questions. The math dollars, the 999,000, which sounds fairly impressive. The last time the government put out a new math program and announced funding dollars, Durham actually ended up a net loser of math dollars. So I'm just trying to figure out, with all the math programming and dollars and envelope dollars we had before, does that 999,000 actually equal more dollars for support for math in Durham, or is actually less dollars for the new math curriculum? Because I really like the new math curriculum, because the new math curriculum usually means less dollars in the classroom. So I'll stop there, but I do have a couple other questions, Chair Forbes.
So in fairness, I think without having the transfer payment agreement and really understanding what's inside that box, it's hard to answer specifically whether or not we're on the winning or losing side. But I agree with you, just in past experiences, every new announcement, new curriculum, we tended to be shortchanged, which does put some more pressure on classroom expenditures.
Well, perhaps the philosophical approach of the government is that if you teach different math in a different way, that somehow you can somehow save dollars when you add up 1 and 1. Maybe it's supposed to equal 2.5 now or something. So,
well, financial literacy is part of the new curriculum, so that's probably what they're trying to tell us to.
Financial literacy almost so means being able to have the dollars to be able to pay to teach financial literacy. And I know you won't have the answer for my second question. I'm just wondering, you know, certainly personally very supportive and proud of the Durham District School Board's initiative on Chromebooks. I think that gave us a significant advantage on being able to reach out in the COVID crisis, which we're still in order to be able to reach out to our students. So proud of that. But what I'm wondering is replacement costs, repair costs. What's that program costing us on an annual basis to be able to replacements? I don't expect you to have the answer.
Well, I can give you something, okay. And that is it's around $6 million a year, and for just the replacement as well as you know, some of the repairs and maintenance, etc. It's a large impact on the budget, a large impact, and you've got a 3-year replacement cycle. That's very, very aggressive, and it's great if we had the money coming in. But it does put a lot of pressure on the school board annually.
Okay, and I thank you for that. And I think that the $6 million is kind of mind-boggling, especially because I think there'd be some funding, but there'd be very little funding for that from the government specifically. It might change on a go-forward basis, because the reality is that school may not look like in September what it looked like in February. And maybe there's a grudging recognition by the government that you have to have the tools to be able to do for the students to do the job, plus also the teachers. I know there are many teachers trying to be able to teach on iPads, which are not necessarily effective as a teaching tool. And I'm not holding anyone responsible for that. It's just the reality of where we're at. But it may behoove us as a board to be able to understand, is a 3-year cycle too aggressive? Because I don't replace my computers at my school, at my work every 3 years. So
Yeah.
maybe it's an opportunity later on for the board to consider other options, because $6 million is a considerable amount of money. And I'm not begrudging it, I'm proud of it, but to be able to take it out of the classroom. So I appreciate that. We can park that one. And I know this one's been answered before, but I'm going to ask the question because I'd like the answer to be in public. I know that Acting Associate Director Markovsky did mention it in one other meeting, and that's particularly about 3 particular schools, GL Roberts, Henry, and Brock, that had significant gaps in the number of teachers versus the programming and the number of students. I know that this has been addressed. We did talk about this at one meeting, but I'd really like it talked about in public, because I think it's important to be able to let those communities know that has been considered within the budget framework.
And I'll ask if Jim could actually respond specifically to the actual allocations to the schools. But
yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Great. Sorry, over to you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So in relation to Trustee Barrett's comments, when we received the Support for Students funds from the ministry this year, we actually received an additional 11.0 staffing funding that can be used to support secondary programming. In relation to his comments, now we did previously have a group of 3 that we did look at. These were low student registration schools. They were Brock High School, they were Henry Street in Whitby, and GL Roberts in the Oshawa area. Since we started this 2-3 years back, the population trends at Henry Street High School have actually improved in Whitby. So we're looking at that school differently. But in relation to GL Roberts and Brock, I can confirm that we have added an additional 3.5 staffing to GL Roberts in Oshawa, an additional 2.0 staffing at Brock High School in the north. And that, to Trustee Barrett's comments, are meant to help support those pressures in relation to effective pathways and planning for students. So that has been done, and that staffing has been taken out from the Support for Students Fund, which was previously noted as the local priority funding.
Okay,
Chair Forbes.
Thank you very much. Oh.
Yes. Sorry, Acting Director Marsh.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that. I think it's important to note when we made the shift as well from the 23 to 1 from 22 to 1 to 23 to 1, we analyzed every single secondary school. And in some instances, it wasn't necessarily low enrollment, but program that drove the decisions. So for example, schools that offered French immersion, because the cohort gets smaller in the senior grades, it then becomes a more expensive program for the district to run. And so in those instances, as an example, we also provided additional sections to some schools so that they could still run a variety of programs and keep the French immersion pathway alive. And so, for example, in Port Perry High School, we added in some sections because of the impact. And so it enabled still a full variety of optional courses to be offered to the students, which I know Trustee Morton is aware of in terms of the arts program there and the business program. So I just wanted to flag that there was a wider scope this year because of the impact of the 23 to 1 funding.
Thank you. All right, so we will move on to Trustee Edwards and then Trustee Morton.
I just have to make 2 comments. I know it was somewhat indicated, but when it comes to the demographic allocation, Jennifer did say that it was, 2006 data, and Durham has changed significantly since 2006. So that that is, again, a huge issue. And then I really have a concern again around repair and maintenance, and not considering what the fall may look like. We're going to probably, we can assume that technology is going to be transported around a little bit more, because going back to school, whatever. So I would be safe to bet that costs will increase when it comes to repair as well. So that's you know, 6 million is a lot, but I can just see that going up a lot more because of what we are going to be faced with over the next year. So those two comments. And then it's more around transportation. I know there's a lot up in the air, but we're funded with transportation per pupil. And I just, there's going to be a lot of impact as well in transportation. So I just want to get a better feel, is that we get this amount and it for per pupil for transportation, and it basically goes to our consortium, and our consortium has their budget as well to as far as transportation and so forth. And I have some huge concerns, because under the new federal guidelines that they put out around school bus transportation, which I've just been reviewed, and then some of the guidelines that were being put out by the government under our planning, there's going to be some additional costs. And how does that, because we're supposed to have a balanced budget, but that's specifically for transportation. How does that come back to us when it comes to, they're going to have a huge cost, and same like provision of PPE and so forth, and we contract that out. How is that going to come back to us as far as additional costs, and how do we report that? Because it really does, they rely on us really for them to get their budget money.
Yeah, it's a good question through you, Madam Chair. I think the question being raised by Trustee Edwards is a very good one. So first of all, let me say that the clawback of $563,000 was actually not pulled back. We did not take it back from the operators. It has been sort of parked as an amount available to them to address their PPE and to address some of the cost pressures they're going to experience going into next year. So we didn't think it was fair when the government came swinging around to pull it back from us to suddenly say to the operators, you know, who have already perhaps been thinking about next year and making some investments to do the same. What we're doing now is, when we're looking at routing according to the various models, we're also trying to give some real estimates on what the potential over charges would be that are beyond, you know, again, the existing contracts. But there's some suggestion that, you know, we don't know how many kids will really be returning. So you don't, you know, guess bus loading and all of that is still very much in flux. Cost pressures, as they come and become more clear to us, will be brought to the ministry's attention for sure. It's, you know, and so at this point in time, we feel pretty confident our budget is fine for the PPE and some of the other costs that may be incurred, not including the salary related costs, if the routing and the number of drivers and the time on road that they might have to pay their drivers increases substantially. At that point, we will be bringing that as an issue to the government.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, over to Trustee Morton.
Thank you, and through you. I was just going to also talk about transportation, and Trustee Edwards has already addressed that. I'm concerned that they are not providing additional funding for that, because as you said, our costs for the fall are very up in the air. We don't know. We anticipate greater expenses, but we won't know until the actual time. Is there anything we can do to discuss this with the province?
Well, and as I said, through you, Madam Chair, we're trying to do the modeling now to get some better indication on what those overtime or on the road charges would be over and above what we currently pay in our existing contracts. We're not at the point right now that we can go to the ministry with anything that is a good simulation, because we're just working on it. But definitely, I mean, this is where the lines of communication have to remain open. We've got to continue to work with our co-terminus board. We'll work with our operators. We'll work with other boards on bringing these issues to the attention of the ministry.
Thank you, Carla.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? I just have one. So we know that we're in the kind of last year of our changes to our small class placements. And I guess my question is more directly around, having the sufficient funds in the SEPA and DESENA, all the enveloped spec ed funds to support the pupil placements that are required by our students. So I just wanted to ask that, and do we think we'll be overfunding again this year based on what we're seeing so far? Over to you.
Thank you, and through you. I appreciate the question. Before we get into our special education class-specific funding too, just want to provide overview as well that we do see funding for our students with special education needs across a number of portfolios outside of the special education allocations. So for instance, facility services is a tremendous partner on accommodations and facility renewal, accommodation strategies for students, say, with vision impairments, and there is no chargeback between departments. They absorb that expense. As well as we see our students supported through the transportation envelope, which has been a conversation this evening, as well as our curriculum area when we see a focus on early intervention strategies and tools. And the team's really trying to immobilize what resources we purchase that serve all students, including those with special education needs. So once we shift over to the placement of our students with special education needs, our board is very proud to provide a range of placements and programs serving our students. Just over 12,000 students access through IEPs. And for the majority of these students, their accommodation needs are met within a regular program. And it is felt to be the most inclusive of programs. So we try and keep our students within regular class placements as much as possible. As a board, we're proud to provide a number of programs for our students who do require a higher level of support, more intensive intervention or specialized services in order to meet with success. And those programs all have clearly identified outcomes for student success, and that was also part of the review, not just the program titling and the locations, but instead of the diagnosis or profile of student needs to obtain the class placement, what would be the student outcome as a result of participating in that program. We have seen an increase in number of students across the board, particularly those with complex developmental disability needs, as well as students who benefit from life skills programming. So within the 2021 school year, we actually see an increase to the number of both of those program types across the system. So I would say fairly confidently that our allocated budget does support these programs across the system. And again, we want to maintain focus on meaningful integration, and the team is looking at that and what that looks like during the 2021 school year, as well as fostering independence for our students along that kindergarten to age 21 pathway for a lot of our students. So although it's the final year for the implementation of the changes related to the review, I do want to just make public record as well that we are committed to an ongoing annual review and adjustment to our special education class placements to have us remain responsive to our community as well. So the big program shifts are completed as an outcome of the review, but we do an annual adjustment. And we generally take a 3 to 5 year outlook on where we place those classes serving students, because we certainly don't want to highlight more transitions in their pathway than necessary. So I do feel confident on the range of programs and services that the team's able to provide. And again, with appreciation to our Board of Trustees as well as our senior team for supporting that.
Thank you, Superintendent McCauley. All right, so seeing no other questions or comments at this time, and I don't believe there's any other business. So we have our next public meeting date is July 8th, so at 6 p.m. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Oh, you guys were all at the same time. I'll go with Trustee Barnes and seconded by Trustee Barrett. All right, all in favor? All right. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.